Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Louise McCarthy. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at Monash University. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of our Alumni Speaker Series this year, which celebrates Monash's proud history. Tonight, a panel of our notable alumni will share their stories. Please welcome actor and satirist Mr Max Gillies, barrister and human rights advocate Mr Julian Burnside, ABC radio presenter Mr Jon Faine, GP and media commentator Dr Sally Cockburn. And of course, the authors of University Unlimited, The Monash Story, Professor Graeme Davison and Dr Kate Murphy. So please enjoy what promises to be a fabulous discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Louise. We're inviting you to do tonight what we've been privileged to do over the last 2 or 3 years and talk to many of the people who belong to Monash. Half a century ago, Melbourne was looking for a site for a new university. All sorts of places were considered. The Melbourne General Cemetery, the Kew Lunatic Asylum, the Caulfield Racecourse. One of the most imaginative ideas came from Melbourne University's Professor of Architecture, who suggested housing it in an immense skyscraper on the site of the Flinders Street railway yards. If he'd only had his way, I'd be welcoming you to the BMW Lecture Theatre of Monash University. Perhaps you had a chance to look at some of those films of the early days of Monash that we were screening up and on the mezzanine just before we came down here. And you'll know that, in fact, it wasn't a great skyscraper at the centre of the city that we finally got to, but a muddy, windswept paddock on a new industrial suburb on the fringes of the metropolis. In our book, University Unlimited, we tell the story of what happened on that paddock. Within a decade of its foundation, Monash became famous and perhaps notorious throughout Australia, not for its location or its modern buildings or its professors, but above all, for its vigorous, sometimes rebellious students. And in our book, we've tried to capture something of their experience and of the excitement of those years. And so tonight, we're going to continue that conversation as we talk to our 4 distinguished former students, all professional talkers, I might add, as they tell us something about the Monash of their time. So Max Gillies, who I'm going to ask to speak first, was among the first cohort of students to arrive at Monash, and he graduated with a BA in 1966. Julian Burnside, a little later, was an economics law student who graduated in 1973. Jon Faine, a little later again, was an arts law student too and graduated in 1981. Sally Cockburn completed her medical degree in 1982. So, proceeding in that order, we will ask them all to tell a little bit about their individual story, and then after they've had a chance to introduce themselves in that way, then we're going to open the floor for a broader discussion and reflection about what Monash meant to them and perhaps also how we look back on that experience today. So, Max, I wonder if you'd like to tell us a little bit about how you came to Monash and what you experienced in the early 60s.
How I travelled to Monash every day with the fellow I shared an apartment with in Caulfield. He would dink me on his motor scooter. So we'd do the motor scooter from which is now the Caulfield campus of Monash. Yeah. It was the old Caulfield Tech in those days. And I'd get on the back of his motor scooter it was, yeah. And we'd drive every day out to Monash. Now, the Dandenong Road was just as hair-raising to ride on as it must be today. I don't think I'd dare do what we did then, but you'd find yourself hemmed in by heavy transports all the way. So I think it's a miracle that we both survived, because as we were talking about before, there were a whole lot of things that changed about the world and the way we live in those days, and one of those things has to do with drinking, social drinking and so on. So I think that anybody of my generation who has survived, we should be very grateful, and it's only by the grace of God that We didn't go the way of our brothers and our comrades. Anyway, so that's beside the point. Yeah. But the world is a different place. When I went to Monash in 1962, I, of course, was one of the generation where I was the first of my family to have a tertiary education of any kind. Yeah. So we were sort of trailblazers, yeah, in a way. And I was very conscious at the time that that didn't apply so much to women, to girls. The girls that did go to tertiary ed, and I've been to a teachers' college before I went to Monash, yeah, and most of my contemporary female, yeah, cohort had left school at leaving because that was as far as their fathers thought they needed to go, and that they needed to subsidise them. So when I think back, I tried to make some notes because I was trying to think back, and the memory is tricky, but that's the first thing to note, that this was a new adventure for this generation. So, and it was a suburban university out, yeah, on the fringes of the suburbs in those days. That was beyond, yeah, outer suburban Melbourne, as it felt to us. It was you mentioned the landscape. It was a windswept, icy windswept. I just remember Monash as being dark and wintry. I can only remember winter. I suppose it's because we didn't spend summer, yeah, on the campus, but it was a cold, bracing experience every moment of the day. And when the Ming Wing went up, while I was there, but of course when I went there, it was not the place that it very rapidly became. And when the Ming Wing was built, which was a skyscraper in the middle of nowhere, it was quite awesome. And you'd go up in these spanking new lifts or the, yeah, escalators to tutorial rooms. That was the other thing I wanted to say, that there were the tutorials that we had, the lectures were all, it was a small number. I think the first year, I read in your book, there were 360 students, yeah, on the campus. So if you break that down into faculties, you're dealing with a yeah, very small group of people. So we had these. I'm rambling. This is an old person rambling. No. What I did want to say, well, I wanted the context that I wanted to put this in. What Australia was a different place, but a couple of things that have some relevance and suggest to me that history doesn't change at the same time as it's completely different. In 1961, when Monash opened, the first coaxial cable linked Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney. Yeah. So it was the first time, and we're in the midst of laying some more cable, yeah, these days for something, yeah, but this was a big thing. It was a cable that would connect, be able to simultaneously transmit 1,260 phone calls at, yeah, the same time, yeah, yeah, from Melbourne to Sydney and to Canberra and back the other way. So we were coming on. 60 Australian officers were sent to Vietnam and Thailand, I, yes, think it was, as advisors to help train the locals in a war that nobody knew anything about. And this was the year after national service in Australia had been, yeah, abolished. And I remember that because I was in the final intake, and mercifully I didn't have to go because...
Well, Max, you and I are exact contemporaries. I was also called up, and God bless Bob Menzies, who spared me national service.
Oh, that's right. I couldn't, and I never thought I'd live to see the day when I'd say, God bless Bob Menzies, but I certainly, when I heard him in person announce that on the radio, and of course the other thing we have to thank him for is Monash itself. Yes. I've probably spoken enough. I've got other notes here, but...
well, we'll come back, and in particular, Max, I know that you began to make some steps into theatre while you were at Monash, and we'd love to hear some stories about that as well. Julian, would you like to carry on the story?
Yeah, we weren't told until we were downstairs that we were expected to do a monologue. That's a pity. I've got 13 words written down as notes, but it's a pity because...
You want a brief from a solicitor.
It's a pity because all through my years at university, I kept a diary. Now, if I'd reread that diary, I could have told a lot of stories that would be worth a lot of actions. Probably just as well. I went to Monash more or less by accident. I was accepted into Melbourne Law, Monash Law, and a couple of other faculties because standards were so low those days. And I chose to go to Monash Law because a boyfriend of my sister's was going there, and I thought I'd know someone. So it's totally accidental, but it was good. I had no particular plan of being a lawyer. Of course, it was very different then at universities. It really was. I mean, Max has mentioned a couple of major differences in the way society was. The end of my first year was the time when we were having a massive drought, by the way, at the end of 1967, and that was when Harold Holt went missing off Cheviot Beach, spirited away by a Chinese or Russian submarine, depending on your view. I never worked out whether it was the Chinese or the Russians. And it was the occasion for one of the great gaffes on radio. I'm sure everyone's heard this, I hope. It was when on the ABC television news, radio news, when they'd been covering this search off Cheviot Beach, and I can't remember the announcer's name, but he said, "And as light falls, the search for the missing Prime Minister comes to a dead halt." Oh. Fantastic. While I was at Monash, I developed an interest in photography, and that was good fun because, A, it enabled me to make an income, and I spent a lot of my time taking photographs of people's babies, people's weddings, and friends who raced motor cars and were very, very proud to get a photograph of them on two wheels going around a corner at Calder. And that was a very good source of income, and I really did harbour ambitions to be a photographer as an artistic photographer, of course, as a living. Luckily for the world of art, I didn't end up doing that. The other thing about university was, especially Monash, because you had to drive out there and spend the whole day there pretty much, you got involved in university life. You mucked around. I mean, lectures were sort of... They were there, you know. I mean, you could go to lectures if you felt like it, and tutorials were pretty good fun. But apart from that, there was sport, and there was sitting in the cafe and drinking the awful coffee and sitting smoking and just lounging around looking for girls, that sort of thing. It was very different. The part-time students were a rarity then. People who had other real jobs alongside their university course were a rarity then. And of course, there's a lot of drinking, but everyone's going to talk about drinking tonight, so I'll pass over that, not least to protect myself. Because I was interested in photography, I became the photographer for Lot's wife for a couple of years, and it is to the eternal discredit of these two that they didn't pick up on that. Because I have, and I told them this before, I've got thousands of negatives that I took at the moratorium marches, the Springboks demonstration, and all of the other huge political issues that were happening in the late 60s when Monash was a hotbed of political activism. A hotbed of political activism, I should say, that did not include me, because although my number had come out of the barrel, and although I was due to be called up when I finished my course, despite all of that, I voted against Gough Whitlam at the end of 1972. Ooh. Although, yeah, I know. Look, I was naive and drunk and I was stupid. But of course, when he did come in, about two minutes after my last exam, he abolished national service, which is the only reason I didn't go to Vietnam and get killed. So that was good. But I've got all these photographs of the Vietnam moratoriums and so on, taken from an ideologically neutral position. And it is actually true. It is quite interesting to look back on them. But there's one thing I want to say on a serious note. At Monash University, I was lucky to have the very best teacher I've ever had in any context anywhere, and that was Professor Louis Waller. Louis Waller was a really great teacher. And apart from anything else, I think he perhaps symbolised what was different about the Monash law course then from the Melbourne University law course then. And he really did by example what Clarence Darrow urged at an earlier time, which is that laws should be like clothes. They should be made to fit the people they serve. Louis Waller's lectures always left you with a clear but unspoken sense that unless the law was serving the people that it was designed for, it was failing in its task. Every lecture, every tutorial involved at least some anecdote that took you outside the present case that you were studying and into the real world, so you could see the parallel development of society on the one hand and legal principles on the other hand, and you could never escape the fact that the two had to be related to each other or else the law was failing. And I will be forever grateful to Monash for the fact that I was able to meet and study under Louis Waller.
Well, thank you. Needless to say, we're going to let the archives know about that cache of photographs. I'm sure they'll be keenly interested. As for Louis, we would have had Louis here tonight but for the fact that he's overseas, and I'm sure he would have loved to have heard. We cannot but support what you've said from so many other people as well about Louis.
Incidentally, one of my readers at the bar was Louis Waller's son, which was a small repayment for what he gave to me.
Well, John, it's over to you.
Sex, drugs and rock and roll. And in that order too. I went to Monash for different reasons again to Max or Julian. I went there to study criminology, where it was offered as part of the undergraduate course, which at Melbourne you could only do it as a graduate diploma. And so I was determined to study criminology when I left high school. And of course, throughout my 5 years at Monash, I never did, even though that was the thing I went there to do. And that was a classic example of the kinds of accidental events in your life that end up shaping you. Of course, as an arts law student, you spend more time for the first few years in the arts faculty than you do in the law faculty, and I felt like a complete stranger in the law school for a long time. Didn't feel I belonged and felt like I was somewhat out of sorts, and in fact was never comfortable there until the later years of full-time law study really kicked in. First year, 1975, was the most miserable year of my life. I was incredibly lonely, felt as if I was in the wrong place, used to walk around at lunchtime looking for a familiar face, searching amidst the crowd for someone I could have a conversation with or sit down and have lunch with. And I used to go home thinking, I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know why I'm persevering. It's a complete waste of my time. And I'm not happy. I'm not enjoying it. And I came from a university family. My father, who gets one mention in your book to his chagrin as my father. My father was a professor at Monash and devoted his life to the institution, including suffering a heart attack for the microbiology department. My mother did a mature age arts degree. My sister was studying arts at Monash. In fact, I'm one of those students in a very rare category of being stoned in the little cafe and having to say to your mother whether or not you want to lift home that day. When you can barely tell that she's your mother and you're not sure what time of day it is as well. Thankfully, I never encountered my father in those circumstances. He was too busy on the other side, or at that stage actually down at the Alfred Hospital campus before the micro building was built out at Clayton. But then I deferred after second year, and by the time I then came back, it all started to make sense. And maybe that's because I did the growing up that I needed to do. And I'm a great believer in deferring. I think going from school to uni for so many students is just a dreadful, dreadful mistake. And then when I did get into the law school in its full swing later on, I just had a ball. And it was sex, drugs and rock and roll. I had sex in the library, sex in the law school, sex in the CAF, not the CAF, sorry, in the Union building, I should be careful here. Sex in the stacks in the main library, and those are the ones I remember.
Various sex?
And I'm just being honest, and I'm sure
old.
the others have stories here, they're just not as prepared to share them, but we'll wait and see what Sally comes up with. That was sex. So drugs, I never used injecting drugs, but I pretty much tried whatever else was on offer. My fondest memory is going to concerts where our student union fees were put to good use making joints out of Lot's wife, which then were passed around the crowd while bands were performing. And, I mean, really, we were off our heads half the time. And, of course, like Julian, we drove when we were drunk. We drove when we were stoned. I mean, it was just ridiculous, and I'm so pleased that the kids growing up now seem so much more sensible, so their survival rate hopefully is reflected in that. I was also, and this is a sombre note, I was at Monash during a very violent time. 75, my first year, was the dismissal, and there was, throughout my 5 years there, I deferred 1 year, so I was there over spanning 6 for my 5 years of study. Yes, it only took me 5 years to do a 5-year course, that's okay. I saw people being bashed. I saw a professor at the opening of the Krongold Centre, Professor Jevons, being felled by a Trotskyite from La Trobe University who was there to protest against Malcolm Fraser. We locked Malcolm Fraser in the toilets at the theatre. We went on countless John Kerr demonstrations where we threw rotten tomatoes, and I never threw condoms with paint in them. I thought that was just going one step too far, but plenty of other people did. And we just were on a spree pretty much from beginning to end, from one protest to another, squeezing in a little bit of a lecture here and there. And my greatest memory of studying is that at the end of each year, when it came towards exams, I'd sit down and actually start to do some work. And I constantly, each year, I'd say, gee, this is really interesting, this stuff. I wish I'd read some of this during the year. I would have probably got a whole lot more out of it. There were two things on the law school side in the sort of 79, 80, 81 period that I really want to touch on, if I may, in the minutes I've got left. One is the role that Springvale Legal Service played in the clinical program that Monash has pioneered and now has been copied in law schools all around Australia, where law students at the end of their course can elect to do a subject working in a legal centre under supervision. And it's transformative, and I saw it transformative, its influence in my life, and then I taught there for a semester with Simon Smith, who's here tonight. And it's just one of the distinguishing features that Monash should be so proud of, having nurtured that, having pioneered it, but then also having sustained it over such a long period of time. It's never got enough money, it's never got enough support, but it was absolutely crucial in turning around the lives and careers of so many people when the law suddenly meant something. It wasn't just steam trains setting fire to haystacks and who was liable for it. It actually meant something to a human being sitting in front of you who you had to help, and that was just huge. The other thing was the High Court of Australia fan club, which was a stunt we got involved in. At the end of, towards my final year, the Queen was coming out to open Sir Garfield Barwick's High Court building that Julian regularly appears in. And those of us who were getting involved in legal aid felt that this was just a ridiculous, bloated and wasteful exercise. More money was spent opening the building than the annual budget for legal centres for all of Australia. And so we decided to make a protest out the front of the High Court. And so Monash students organised for a national convergence in Canberra of law students protesting, and what we did was we formed the High Court of Australia fan club, and we sold a T-shirt that had a cartoon of a donkey wearing a judge's wig with High Court of Australia fan club around it. We've just produced 20 of them, thinking these would be a nice souvenir. We ended up selling literally hundreds, 500, 600, I can't remember, but we had to keep reprinting as they became a kind of cult item around Australia in law schools all around the place. What it meant was that we generated a lot of income for the High Court of Australia fan club, and we became the wealthiest club on campus. We used the money to pay for minibuses for students to come from Sydney, Adelaide and Melbourne to go and protest at the Queen at the High Court opening, where we found when we arrived there were snipers with guns trained on us from the roof of the building, and a policeman with a lot of jewellery on his epaulets coming over to us and saying, "What do you lot think you're doing?" And we were saying, "Well, we're law students." And he'd go, "I don't give a shit, son. You know, what do you think you're up to?" And he said, "There's only one thing I want to make sure of." And he said, "What's that?" He said, "Are you going to put detergent in the fountain?" And we went, "Shit, that's a great idea. We never thought." Is it too late to go and get some? But we behaved ourselves, and we got a donkey with a wig and paraded it around. We got the front page of the paper. We made the evening news. It was all a great thing. So really just a few other things. Lunchtimes were more important than lectures. Lectures, if you did go, were always better after lunch because the lecturers had been to the club and were lubricated and much more entertaining than morning lectures, which were to be avoided at all cost. I published a counter-faculty handbook. There's a scurrilous story that Julian would need to defend me on, probably all sorts of defamation and other matters if I was to tell the full story, but we published a profile of every lecturer in the law school in the counter-faculty handbook, including some very unflattering things about a couple of them. one of whom tried to have me thrown out of the law school then and there. And thanks to Laurie McCready, I was allowed to stay, but it was a very threatening thing to have happen to you. But Frisbee was more important than the rest. My billiard skills have been refined, courtesy of the tables in the basement of the Union building. And it was a glorious time. Yes, we did learn Louis Waller, and Peter Hanks was, to me, Peter Hanks was the Louis Waller that Julian had. He was someone who just changed the way I saw the course, the law, and what it could do and what it could be about. So, yes, it was formative. It was rebellious. It was something, as I look back on it, I probably look back on it more fondly now than I appreciated at the time.
Well, thanks, John. I mean, you saved me the time. Another witness has told me that you were seen on the top of the Crongold Centre that day when the Prime Minister was locked in the toilet. So you've outed yourself. I don't need to ask you the question.
But I didn't hurt anyone.
No, you didn't hurt
anyone. No, I didn't hurt anyone, and I was deeply distressed that someone was hurt.
Yeah.
And, in fact, went to help Professor Jevons and told him who'd hit him.
Did you?
In fact, because I thought it was just unconscionable.
Yeah.
And it terrified me because I thought the mob's got out of control here. That's not what it should be like.
In a moment or two, we might talk a little bit about the political moods and the changing political moods of Monash. But Sally, you overlapped a bit with John. Did you see things from the same perspective?
Well, no, because in medicine we lived in our own little world. In fact, that's always been a criticism of the medical faculty, that, you know, those medical people were over there up the sort of southwestern corner of the university. We didn't see ourselves as elite. We didn't see ourselves as any of those things. But something you said, John, really resonated. You said you walked out at lunchtime and thought, who do I speak to? Medicine was like going to school again. They were we had the same people in the class. Everyone knew everybody, and we had friends. We watched a lot of the stuff that you guys did on the little green grassy knoll between the Ming Wing and the Union, and snogging and stuff like that. And we looked with awe and thought, well, we'll just go inside and have a pie. And we couldn't get into the small cafe because it just was too thick with smoke. But yeah, it was interesting. We were sort of bystanders, I think, to a lot of that, because medicine was very regimented. You did have to turn up to lectures. You did have to turn up, or they wouldn't let you come back. It was a bit like school, really. So I don't know whether we grew up a lot. We grew up when we left campus and went off campus. And your father taught me. What a wonderful, wonderful man he is. Just a fantastic person. And, I mean, why did I go to Monash? Well, my older brother was a law student. He was actually a member of, I think he was a member of sobriety, or was it what's the sort of sobriety club? There was some sobriety, no, it couldn't have been a sobriety club. No. Couldn't have been a member of that. And I was a member of the Young Libs and the Gun Club and something like that, but he said, in fact, I've said it now, he'll hate that I've just told everyone because it's way against his ethics. Anyway, he was my sort of, I looked up to my brother, and he went to Monash. Even though my father was a professor at Melbourne University, I went to Monash because I could get a lift from my uncle, was really one of the main reasons, because he worked out at the Caterpillar factory. And I have to say that one of the first things I did when I got to Monash was went and tried out for Mumco, the musical theatre company. I got one of the lead parts in The Boyfriend, and I went back and was counselled by my absolutely all-time most fantastic, he's the Louis Waller of medicine, Eric Glasgow, Professor Eric Glasgow, the anatomy professor, who said, if you want to pass medicine, you don't do any of these extracurricular things. And I must say, I think he was wrong. I lament the day that I never actually took up that part. But look at me now. In fact, I'd just like you to take a notice here. Pick up your pen for a minute, John, and hold it in the air like that. 100% of Monash graduates who have their own radio show are left-handed. So there you go. But the thing, and I think the thing about Monash was there was this sort of feeling that you had the right to question. You had the right to stand up and say why. And I think it went right throughout all the teaching, that our teachers didn't expect us to just take what they said as a given. And I think that's the Monash message that I've taken, and that I try to now say when I go back and talk to students, that it's okay to say, prove it. And I also think the other thing is that they don't drink as much as we do, and that's a damn good thing.
It's true. I think that right from the beginning, Monash was intent upon trying to be different in some way. And I think both in law and in medicine particularly, there was a very strong emphasis upon learning from practice. The clinical model, which began in medicine, adopted in law, in more modified ways in education, I think was an important thing. But why don't we try and throw that question around a bit? I mean, what is it that made the Monash experience different or distinctive in your eyes? Max, did you have any? Well,
I think listening to the people who came after it made me think that John talked about the radical and Julian too. It became very soon after I left a hotbed of activity and sex and drugs and rock
when
and
your
roll.
conservative influence had left.
Exactly. But I was thinking there were probably the germ of that was probably there at the beginning, even though it was a very small group of people, and it was a bit like family. You knew everybody except if you were arts, economics, law. You didn't know anyone from medicine. It was interesting.
We
what
wanted
Sally...
to know you.
No, I'm sure you didn't. We wanted to know you.
You should have got out of it.
But there was always... It was another place, and we never saw you.
Can I just comment on that?
In school all day.
They gave us the opportunity in medicine at Monash to do something else in first year. So you could have gone and done another subject somewhere else in university.
Yes,
that's right.
I chose NG Maths.
Not a good choice.
It was a great way to meet boys, but that's about it.
Well, I think too there was an air among the founding professors. I mean, if you think of the first professors, Rod Andrew, who was Dean of Medicine, Jock Marshall, characters like Ian Turner, they were all pretty radical. And in some respects, I think the students were learning from their teachers.
Well, that's what I was going to say, actually. Although there were quite the other professors, the majority of professors were genial and conservative in bearing, or in social manner at least, but there were one or two standouts, and they made their mark. You mentioned Jock Marshall. Now, if you read the book, you'll see a couple of stories about Jock, but he was a radical nationalist, I suppose, and he wore his heart on his sleeve, and he was very... I think you've got a story about how when they were trying to adopt a coat of arms for the university, and Jock, and I remembered this, Jock had wanted a lyrebird incorporated, but this was whoever...
Well, it was sent to the College of Heralds in London, and they said there was no such thing as a lyrebird as far as heraldry is concerned. So he was knocked back on that, and in order to try and get his way, he then decided at least he would suggest the motto for the university.
That's right.
And they were determined not, of course, to have a Latin motto. At first they hoped for an English motto, and eventually it was Jock Marshall who came up with the Italian from Michelangelo, Ancora Imparo, which of course is still our motto. So he was a funny blend of the traditionalist. I mean, if he was a complete radical, you'd said, why bother about coats of arms and mottos at all?
Exactly. But then there were really active. He was active. He didn't just talk the rhetoric. There was the famous case of a row of poplars being planted. I don't exactly know where it was, but we knew about it.
Yes.
And Jock had organised some people at midnight to go and uproot the things because he was passionate about
Australian
Indigenous.
That's right.
Yeah, you've probably got more stories. So,
Max,
so that was there right from the start.
Before we were talking to you, we didn't give you a chance to tell us about your first moves into theatre. I believe you played Caliban in The Tempest while you were at Monash. Is that correct?
I believe it was. I have no memory. Is not what it was. But the one thing I do remember about that production, we didn't have an indoor theatre at that stage. So it was out on this bleak windswept plain that we've talked about. We did our first couple of productions out of doors, so it was quite. The audience found it. They must have. I wonder we had anybody still able to walk home after this.
Would this have been your first experience of theatre or not?
No, I'd done school, and I'd done a few things at other campuses, but by and large, yes. And I did the production of The Tempest, where I played Caliban. I was actually the director of the play, and the fellow I'd cast as Caliban met with a terrible accident on the road from Monash to his home in Altona, as I remember it. So suddenly I was without a Caliban, so that's the reason I played Caliban. But all I can remember about the production is outdoor theatre. There was a little courtyard, a lawned courtyard between the medicine faculty and science opposite the Union building, and it had an ornamental pond, lake in it. I don't know whether it still exists, but we used that as the scene for the shipwreck that begins The Tempest. So that was very inventive. I thought this was great. All I can remember is every night Peter Steedman, some of you will have heard of him. He may not. He may be with us this evening.
He may be here tonight.
Is he here?
Is Pete here?
Yeah.
He can't come. What a pity.
Can't come. Well, okay. So Peter had a Harley Davidson, and he was a bit of a show-off by and large. And why I remember that is because we were trying to do this highfalutin play, and Steed rode around the periphery of the thing all night on his Harley Davidson. That's all I remember of the production. And of course, Steedman, I believe, was the first editor of Lot's Wife, or one of the early
first, Kate?
He was in the first group.
First group. Well, he became, but then
maybe it was
did
the
he not
second.
Take it over, and he probably had more. He seemed to go on forever and ever. You could. He was editor year after year for as long as I could seem. For my entire life at some stage.
Peter Steedman was also the first Monash student to be disciplined by the university.
Yeah.
And
I wish it had happened before our production.
So actually, he was fined something like $15, which must have been a lot in those days. But somebody else who was fined by the university for misconduct.
No, it was pounds actually.
Pounds.
It was £12 or something like that. A lot of money. £1 was a lot of money.
And it was, so was it £4 that you were fined, Julian, for your...
No, I was fined $4. I started in 67, remember? Decimal currency came in 66.
So
but Pete Steedman was fined £12, as I recall.
Okay.
Can you tell us how this occurred, Julian?
How it occurred?
Your fine, the beginning of your...
Well, look, I didn't even remember it until I read the book, but apparently I pushed the stop button on one of the escalators in the Ming Wing, as you do, and... someone got upset. I have no recollection of it.
This was not a gesture of protest or anything?
No, I was just mucking around. I didn't have any ideology. I really didn't have any ideology back then. I think I was just...
You just discovered you could reach the buttons.
Well, that's right. No, for the first time I could see the buttons. I must have had an extra coffee that morning. But I learned to hate motorcycles when I was at university because I was driving home from Monash along the Princes Highway early one morning, nothing on the road. I'm just driving along, a very small car, and then I saw a pair of headlights behind me, and they were approaching very fast. I mean, I was going fast, and it was gaining on me really fast, and I thought, my God, what am I going to do? And I didn't know whether to swerve left or swerve right, and all of a sudden, whoom, and two motorcycles went past, one on either side, exactly parallel to each other. And if I'd swerved, it would have been bad for all of us, all except the other one. But you know, I was thinking downstairs, 1967 or 68, the Herald Sun had a campaign called Declare War on 1064. I wonder if anyone remembers that, because 1,064 people had died on Victorian roads the previous year.
That's right.
That's how different things were in those days, when we're all driving a whole lot less.
Yeah. And now, of course, Monash has the MUAC, where we're actually doing the research into what's working, and so the evolution is amazing.
Impressions of Monash in the 60s into the 70s have dominated this image of it being a very radical place. Julian, you've in some ways thrown some doubt in my mind about this. We think of you, these days of having been a radical character, and we assume that it must have somehow had to do with it. But do you think that's a misleading impression? Because after all, it's also the Monash by this stage of Peter Costello and Michael Kroger, isn't it? So how do we disentangle?
Well, they were later than me, but
my generation.
And by the way, Peter Costello also read with me as well as Louis Waller's son. But no. It was very radical, and in fact, the received wisdom back then was that any law graduate from Monash would never get a job because it was regarded as such a ratbag place. That didn't worry me because I wasn't planning to be a lawyer anyway. But the thing is, I mean, I regard myself still as quite conservative.
Yes.
It's just that the whole political spectrum has moved so far to the right that people think I'm radical. I mean, it's unbelievable, ludicrous.
Yeah.
It's a disgrace in society that anyone like me should be regarded as a radical.
Yeah.
You know, just because I think we shouldn't lock up innocent people indefinitely. Well, wow, that's a terrible. What a shocking idea that is. Now, you know, but of course back then the radicalism expressed itself as huge and in some cases unfocused and perhaps sometimes pointless demonstrations against authority generally, with a focus one year on Vietnam and another year on parking, car parking. I mean, you know, that's when I began to wonder what the hell was going on, when the protests about the Vietnam War were just as intense as the protests about car parking for students.
Yeah.
You know, but it was exciting.
There's lots of theories about why Monash, or why was Monash so prominent in that radical sort of period.
Because there was nothing else to do. We were so far out in the sticks.
That's right.
There was that, or there was the knot. I mean, you know, and that's where the knot was the incubator.
Yeah.
You couldn't go and have coffee and gamble down in Lygon Street.
Oh, I was in fourth year before I realised that the Notting Hill Hotel was not part of the campus.
See, my direct generation of law students, Tim Costello and Peter Costello, and both Krogers, Andrew and Michael, and Mark Birrell, and Adam Kempton, John Thwaites, they're just the ones off the top of my head that I can think of. So whether there was something in the water, I don't know, but you can look at that equivalent period at any other law school in Australia, and it hasn't spawned anything like the same coterie of people who have gone on to make that sort of a contribution. And ironically, for Monash's lefty reputation, the bulk of those people, of course, have made their political careers in conservative politics, and more than made their mark, even very recently. So, you know, it's quite extraordinary. And if you look also at the equivalent period, I don't know if it's the same with Julian, but if you have a look, I mean, I think we've often remarked that the President of the Court of Appeal, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Chief Judge of the County Court and the Chief Magistrate at the moment in Victoria are all Monash graduates, which is really just unbelievable. It's quite extraordinary. And if you try and look at the equivalent period that I was at law school and say, well, who of note came out of Melbourne Uni Law School? Peter Gordon and Rob Starry. And other than that, you're struggling to think of anybody. I'm sure there are lots of people who have had eminent careers in the law, but within, I'm talking beyond the law, you know, having used it to make a broader contribution, not a lot of names spring to mind. Maybe Julian can add to some. So just in that one faculty, it really is quite extraordinary, that contribution. And it goes back to the teachers, the calibre of the leadership, and the, you know, the DNA of the law school.
But it was permission to achieve. It was that, you know, you can make it. There are no barriers. I think that, I don't know because I didn't go to Melbourne University, but I got the feeling we're the establishment, you do what you're told and you become what we tell you. But at Monash it was, you can be anything. I really felt like...
Except in the law school, you can be anything except a lawyer because you won't get a job. But I don't think anyone really paid attention to that.
There's another contribution. Campbell McComas, who is much missed, having died how many years ago now? 10 years ago. And the impact, his pranking started out with a famous hoax lecture where at lunchtime in my first year in 75 there was a lecture offered. Now the standard first year textbook is by Professor Glanville Williams. Glanville, I always get them muddled up. Glanville Williams, it's the Introduction to Law book. And so at lunchtime we were told there was a lecture from this eminent professor, and no one really noticed that it was one letter different. It was Granville Williams instead of Glanville Williams. And it was his first big public hoax. And he went and delivered a lecture, and everyone was supposed to go, and I refused to. I said, I'm not going to see some boring old fart from Oxford at lunchtime. I could be playing frisbee. So I didn't actually go. But of course it's taken on legendary status. But that sort of attitude that Steve Stern, McComas and Jack Hammond had, and that you know, taking a shot at the establishment was in the water. It was just part of the way the place worked.
Can I? I was thinking about the that big period of ferment, the Vietnam business. I was always struck, having been through Monash before that all erupted, that I'd been to a fairly conservative university. My experience of it had been conservative, but when I say conservative in tone, there were certainly radicals, and there were radical. One of the things that occupied our minds in 1962 was who were the ASIO agents on the campus. And we always, there were big debates about this. Yeah. We thought we knew, and other people said, no, it can't be them, that's just a front. They're putting, so you were trying to work out what was going. So there was always an interest in politics, but it wasn't radically expressed. Yeah. And then after I left university, as I said, there was, first of all, I think it was the rapid escalation of our involvement in Vietnam that certainly affected the whole of society, but Monash seemed to be a perfect forum for the social dissent that came up. I mean, things like sit-ins. The sit-in was a fantastic event idea, and I probably came from the States originally, but there were people whose names I can't remember, and I probably should, because people went on into the media and so on, who took over, you'd take over lecture theatres and whole buildings for 24 hours, 48 hours for continuous analysis and
and discussions. There were teach-ins as well as sit-ins, weren't there?
That's exactly right.
It really put Occupy into practice.
It did. Well, it did. I mean, it's sweet to see Occupy trying to do, and rather disheartening to see that it can't have the focus that it did. But what gave that the focus was the sudden our participation in this war, and we all had, so the first sticker on the car was no conscripts for Vietnam, and of course that was the activating thing in our society. That's what turned people against Vietnam, because of this weird form of conscription we had, and that the people who had brought it into operation were people who were only 10 years older than the people who they were putting their ballot, their birthday into a ballot for. People like the colt from Kooyong and Malcolm Fraser. They were ministers for the army and so on. They were in their 40s, and they came up with this
ballot,
birthday ballot. Sorry. So anyway, and it happened very quickly. That was the other thing, over a couple of years.
But mind you, similar things were happening in Paris, in Chicago, in San Francisco. Why Monash rather than Melbourne? I rather suspect that the answer may be that at Melbourne University you could get a really fine education, but the subtext was you will be the same as the people who are teaching you. At Monash, the unstated theme always was you're allowed to be different. And I think that's a natural breeding ground for the sort of ferment that we saw, sometimes for bad, but very often for good.
I wonder if this is a moment to kind of come forward a bit in time, because we're now looking back on that period, and what comes out to me is what a distinctive time and place this was. This was a time when, as you've explained to us, if you went to Monash, it's difficult enough to get there. If you were there, you were hanging out all day. Now we live in the age, don't we, of the part-time student. All students are effectively part-time. The learner-earner. It's become. We were conscious, I suppose, in the 60s too, that we were a privileged minority of people who are getting to university. We now, fortunately, in many ways, it's become democratised, but in the process, become perhaps less distinctive. Looking back now on those days, how do you see them, and how do you see them in relationship to the experience of the current generation of students? Sally, would you like to?
Yeah, I was just thinking that really what you're talking about is a little foreign to me. When Monash in 1976 was free, we were having lattes and we had the Whole Earth Cafe. And fortunately, the small cafe was still there. It wasn't a small deli, which it is now. But there wasn't any radicalism. We were partying, and you guys set that radicalism happening. Albert Langer was someone we'd heard about. Yeah. But, and I really think that was when it started to change. And I think you're right. There was an influx of foreign students. We started to see faces that we'd never seen before because we all came from our little schools out in the suburbs. And it was becoming, the fee-paying students from overseas was a new phenomenon. But I have to say, what you're talking about, the medical school is still the same.
Yeah.
The thing that amazes me every year, I go back and talk on orientation week, and the thing that always amazes me, they look exactly the same. They're wearing the same jeans, the same T-shirts, and they're sitting there being as scruffy as ever. So, I don't know, the medical students don't change.
Yeah. How do the rest of you feel about that, John?
Well, the first time I met an Aboriginal person were the Dodson brothers.
Yeah.
Pat was finishing, I think, in my first year, but Mick came and was a student for a short while. I think he did a year and decided that it was a waste of his time, and he was probably right to spend more time at law school. But it was extraordinary to be in lectures and at lunchtime at meetings and things with someone, and you just looked at him and thought, wow, that's a side of life I'm not familiar with, and it opened your eyes. I'm glad Sally mentioned the Whole Earth or Whole Foods Cafe or whatever, because there was the whole hippie side of things, people who'd walk around without shoes on and people who didn't wash, and that was they weren't holy people, but they obviously understood something about the world that the rest of us hadn't yet cottoned on to. And the other thing that hasn't been mentioned but was really important is the whole women's movement, which was unfolding around us and sweeping us up. And I mean, all you had to do was say the wrong word in conversation, and you were, I remember it was Bob Hawke's daughter, Sue Hawke, who was one of my contemporaries, and she ruled the roost like, you wouldn't believe. And if you were what we would now say was politically incorrect, but back then I don't think politically incorrect had been coined, but you were pulled into line very, very fast. And that whole awareness that there was a revolution, literally a revolution taking place around you, was very much my period. Between 75 and 80. I want to mention Patrick McCackey.
Yeah.
He was giving lectures in the arts faculty, and even though I never enrolled in his subject, we all went to his lectures.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he had 200 students, he had 500 people in his lectures. They were just packed out time and time again. The same for Herb Feith in politics. And these are people, I don't know how many people would have taught me over the years, but there are people who just are etched into your consciousness, who made an impression that has lasted all these years. And then for the wrong reason, Andrew Theophanous, who failed me in one of two things I failed in the entire time I was there. And I felt a great sense of injustice then, shared by him feeling a great sense of injustice later on. And I thought, well, now you know how I felt, Andrew, when you wrongly failed me on a politics unit that I was taking. But no, he was a great lecturer too, although he failed me, so I can't quite forgive him. I want to mention the hitching point. It was a big part of my Monash experience, hanging out at the hitching point, these little things, and falling in love with, countless women who were driving cars saying, I wonder if she's going to give me a lift today and I can get to talk to this girl that I've seen walking around on the campus. That was a very big part of the daily routine, and I don't think I was ever a stalker in the official sense of it. But on today's definitions, I probably came quite close.
Concluding thoughts from you, Julian, have you?
Well, I don't know, because I haven't been to university for a long time, and I don't really have any clear sense of what it's like, although the university students I meet all seem much more serious than the university students in my time. They're the learner-earner thing that you mentioned. So university is just a fragment of each day instead of being a new phase of their life. Now, obviously, we all tend to think that our own past is the way things ought to be. And I could be utterly wrong about it, but being at university was an opportunity to do things, learn things, experience things that no other part of your life offered. And to have regarded university just as something in between doing a serious job, I think would have been a terrible waste. I mean, I think I learned more about everything else than I learned about law at Monash. And I will never regret that. I probably should have learned more law, but it was just brilliant having a chance to learn all sorts of fascinating things from all sorts of random people who you met just because you were hanging around. And I think what university students really miss now is the university experience. Although Mungo McCallum would say that, in fact, that his generation was the one that took the dying days of real university experience, so I missed out completely.
Can I just add to that? My daughter is concluding 6 years at Monash at the end of this year, and listening to her and her experiences, I think it's still alive.
Yes.
I really do. I mean, the thing that I really like about the law faculty now is she went for 3 months to study law in Florence.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
Now, I mean, hello. We're lucky to go to Paran. Hello. And I said, what are you going to study
Why
Italian
isn't
law?
this forum on in Florence?
Exactly.
That's what I want to know.
Well, I thought you said we're doing this again in Florence.
Well, maybe that's a good note to finish on, because I think what you confirm is that in Monash, and certainly from my vantage point as a teacher, there are still those moments in the classroom when things light up and wonderful things happen and students are transformed. And thank you all for telling us about your experience. And I think, Louise, you were going to wrap it up for us.
What a privilege it has been to share the enlightening and entertaining insights of our fabulous panel. Please join me in thanking Max, Julian, Jon and Sally.